Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. Today is June 5th, 2023, and let's get to the news happening in Ukraine, shall we? So today, I can officially say that the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Zaporizhia has started, mainly due to the fact that a lot of pro-Russian military bloggers and Russian news media are discussing the fact that they're losing some ground around Velika Novosilka, which is in the Zaporizhia front between Vuhledar and Velika Novosilka. So the town or the settlement that Ukrainians are currently attacking is around the area of Novodonetsk. And so, as previously mentioned in the last video, is that one pro-Russian military blogger was talking about unpleasant situations in Zaporizhia, but now it's getting very, very serious for them. And you can see that the Ukrainian forces are stepping up efforts in the Vuhledar area. He says that the situation on Novodonetsk and to the left towards the Velika Novosilka is difficult. The Ukrainians are having a sense of success, and they're throwing additional forces into the battle. And they're saying that they've recorded up to 30 units of armored vehicles. So overall, things are going great there. Also, the Russians are mentioning that the Ukrainians are jamming the communications, Russian communications, so they cannot coordinate an effective defense against the Ukrainians. So that's another great thing going for the Ukrainian forces. And one last thing I want to talk about is obviously we're all aware that there is the Ukrainian MOD talking, the Ukrainian general staff talking about being silent about, talking about the details of this offensive. So I'm going to try to keep it very general. But of course, if this is already out, all the news already on Twitter and on the main news networks, I think it's pretty safe to talk about them. But the thing that kind of really makes me a little bit disappointed is the fact that credible news sources, due to the fact that the Ukrainians are not going to be commenting anymore about the details of their offensives, the Russians are going to use that to their advantage to start claiming a bunch of bullcrap, including what we're seeing today on BBC News on their main page, saying that citing Russian sources to write their articles, basically. And now they're saying that Russia says it thwarted major Ukrainian counteroffensive. And now it's time to pack up the bags and go home, I guess, right? It didn't work out, right? We tried once. I guess I can say I tried, it makes no sense to be using Russian sources at this point to write your articles, right? And coming from a very credible news source, BBC News, I would expect more than this. We know that the Russians are going to be manipulating, they're going to be lying, they're going to be bending the truth. And they know that they're going to have a massive propaganda operation right now because it's their time to kind of shine. And they know that the Ukrainians are not going to respond to what the Russians are saying. So I think it's a very dangerous time to be trusting what the Russians are saying. We know that they're liars, right? They've been lying that, the counteroffensive is going according to plan, right? The Russian offensive, I should say, is going according to plan, that the special military operation is still a special military operation. It's not a war, right? Houses are burning in Belgrade, but it's still a war in Ukraine, right? It's a very special. So what I'm trying to get into is that we need to be careful with hope it's not going to become a trend that Western news is going to now pick up what the Russians are saying as something credible or citing them. According to the Russians, like, who cares what the Russians think, right? They're liars. Let's stop talking about them, right? The less we talk about them, the better it will be. About whatever the hell they think in Moscow, I think it's really important that we pay minimum attention to what the journalists, the elites are saying there, right? I'll cover it once in a while because I think it's ridiculous, some of the things that they're saying, but we need to forget about discussing or using them as a credible source. It's just not acceptable at this point. Let's take a look as well at the axes that the Ukrainians have opened. So overall, this is where the main fighting is currently ongoing. So it's around Novodonetsk. And so the Ukrainians are pushing here between Vuhledar and Velika Novosilka. And you can see also there's a trend of the Russians usually trying to use rivers as defense lines. And you can see that there's a large concentration of Russian forces here, but they're all very close to this river called Mokry Yale, if I'm not mistaken. This is the river Mokry Yale, not very massive, but that gives me an interesting recurring theme, because when the Ukrainians launched their offensive in Kherson, They were also battling the Russians along the Ingulets River, where there was a large concentration of Russian forces. And I think that the same theme here can be seen in Zaporizhia, whereas the Russians are usually concentrated close to bodies of water, right? If you look at Polohe as well, it's right beside a river. So I think that there is a recurrent theme where the Russians usually likes being close to the water, obviously for various reasons, but it's a natural barrier of defense. It's difficult to cross, right? So I think that this is why the Ukrainians are usually attacking closer to rivers. Additionally, some sources report the reason why the Ukrainians chose this direction compared to other ones is because allegedly, due to the success that the Ukrainians were having a few weeks ago in Bakhmut, the Russian MOD had no choice but to pull out some forces that were defending this area from Novodonetsk to Bakhmut, meaning that they've left some holes in this area. So the Ukrainians saw this opportunity and attacked as a few days ago. And I think that this is also going to be a very recurrent theme. That's the game plan for the Ukrainian forces, is finding the exposed or weaker areas where the Russians are stationed and attacking them. And I think that the Belgrade raids are also part of that, because obviously the Russians are going to have to keep more soldiers within Russia along the border between Ukraine and Russia, just so they don't get embarrassed by these constant incursions. But they still will get embarrassed, because we see how effective they are at drawing out the Free Russian Legion. And I'll get to that a little bit later. So overall, that's the game plan for the Ukrainian forces: attacking, forcing the Russians to use other forces elsewhere to defend the areas they're being attacked in, and that's going to leave another hole exposed that the Ukrainians are going to utilize to attack again. So just finding these areas of opportunity, as I mentioned a few videos ago, I think that's what the Ukrainians are currently seeking. And let's keep our expectations realistic as well. I don't want to go too ambitious and saying that within a few weeks, Ukraine's going to get the entirety, recapture the entirety of the Zaporizhia region. I think we need to give some time, some patience for the Ukrainian army, because it's not going to be as easy as we all think it's going to be. Just watching, the videos, it's extremely, extremely exposed terrain. Right. Basically, the fighting is going along the posadkas, which are kind of these thin, dense, areas with trees and bushes and things like that, where you can hide underneath, beneath the trees, basically. But Zaporizhia is known to be very, very flat and very exposed. So it's a much more difficult terrain compared to Kharkiv, but quite similar as well to Kherson, right? It's not that different, but that's where the challenge lies in, is because you're so exposed and you have drones flying and you have satellite images as well that can really capture the movement in real time. It's difficult for both sides to be able to move very quickly in the offensive. So let's be patient and realistic in terms of the Zaporizhia offensive. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about is Bakhmut, because the Ukrainians are also having some good success in the Bakhmut front. And there's nothing more enjoyable than to hear it from Prigozhin first, because he seems to have become the best source of information of Ukrainian advances. But I think we know why. Prigozhin is very invested into Bakhmut, was invested and still is, because of the amount of forces he had to waste to capture the city and the resources, right? And it all ended up in a very Pyrrhic victory for him, right? He didn't really get much out of it, except perhaps a little bit of glory. But now he says that the Russian forces are losing control over Berkhivka, so that's just north of Bakhmut, and the Ukrainians are getting closer and closer to Paraskoviivka. So this is months worth of fighting that the Russians have had in this area to capture these two small villages. And now the Ukrainians, in a matter of a few days, again, are having a lot of success and are pushing out the Russian forces, meaning that they're depleted. They're extremely depleted, and I don't see them being able to defend as well as they were able to, last year. That's for sure. And he says that they're having success not only in the north, but also in the south around Klishivka, where the Ukrainians also are pushing the Russians away from the T05-04 highway. So the Ukrainians are taking back quickly what was lost, over the duration of many months. So in the map, just to kind of overlook what's going on, so Berkhivka again is in this area. as you can see. So the Ukrainians are pushing around here. They're trying to get into Krasna Hora and perhaps, force the Russians to withdraw to Bakhmutske and also take back Soledar, which is a little bit north. And then Klishivka is around here, as you can see. So the Ukrainians are pushing the Russians here. They're trying to get the high ground. Again, once they have the high ground here, they're going to have an open site. It's going to be a lot easier for them, at least, to hit the Russians around Opetne, Ivangrad, all these small little settlements south of Bakhmut, and start really pushing the Russians out of the city itself. And it's going to be difficult for the Russians to defend because, first of all, Bakhmut is completely destroyed, right? There's, the buildings that are they're still there and standing, they're extremely vulnerable to being hit by mortar or artillery. Like the Russians don't really have much to hide in. So for them, they're going to be extremely exposed, and I think part of it is just getting the high ground again, getting back into these good positions that Ukrainians had, and really start forcing the Russians out of Bakhmut. Forcing them yet again, because this would be a massive blow if the Russians lose this within a matter of a few weeks, if not, let's say, months, to be generous, because I have no doubt that the Ukrainians would be able to take back Bakhmut within the end of the summer, that this would be a huge embarrassment for the Russians. So guess what? Basically, the Russians would have to do the same thing like they did a few weeks ago in Bakhmut and continue drawing forces from other fronts to Bakhmut to reinforce it, because they wouldn't be able to bear the embarrassment of losing the city, right? That they just claimed they got, right? That would be horrific for them. So overall, we're seeing a trend where the Ukrainians are just finding opportunities of attack, and they see that the Russians are definitely responding to that. They're very reactive, and so that leaves a lot of opportunities for the Ukrainian forces. So that's the situation for the map. I'm very, very optimistic, but again, as I said, we need to keep our expectations realistic. At the same time, I think it's going to be a long battle. We might be still talking about this counteroffensive even in the fall and the winter, because the Russians still have a very large army. And I think what's really important is that we define a successful counteroffensive based on Ukraine's definition and not on NATO's definition or other countries that are allied with Ukraine, right? What France can see as a successful counteroffensive is not what the Ukrainians see it. And let me define it to you. It's very clear. A successful counteroffensive for the Ukrainian people is taking back everything post 1991, right? 1991, we want to get back Luhansk, we want to get back Donetsk, the entirety of Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea. That is what a successful counteroffensive is. Anything less than that is not a successful counteroffensive for the Ukrainians. And so for, let's say, Macron, perhaps what he sees as a successful counteroffensive would be taking back some territory and him getting a phone call from Putin ready to negotiate. I'm sorry, but that's not how the Ukraine is going to see it as a successful, negotiation counteroffensive for the Ukrainians. So I think we also need to be mindful of that. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about is the situation in Belgrade. So today there was a video that came out. The Free Russian Legion is right now in Novaya Tavozhanka, claiming that they are controlling the settlement. It's about 5,000 people strong. They're not there anymore because they all fled. And they want to remind that it's not a small abandoned village, but a settlement where 5,000 people live. Now it's empty, and they're only fighters of the Russian Volunteer Corps here. There is no other power in this region. If Mr. Gladkov cannot control his territory, we'll talk only to his superiors who are in Moscow. And Gladkov is the governor of the Belgrade Oblast, if I'm not mistaken. So overall, I think this is a very positive trend. These raids are definitely helping Ukraine. They force the Russians to be embarrassed continuously because they can't respond to them. And so far, it's been 3 weeks of these border raids, and the Russians still haven't had a proper response against them. But however, I don't think this is going to be spreading like wildfire throughout Russia. Unfortunately, still about 72 to 75% of the Russian population supports the war in Ukraine. They support the idea of, killing Ukrainian people, unfortunately. And so for this to be successful and spread like wildfire, they're going to need the support of the Russian population, which they currently do not have. And so I think that there could be some more specific areas within Russia that would be able to perhaps replicate this type of raid. And I'm looking, as I've said previously, the Russian Caucasus, which has had, you know, a rebellious phase in the 90s and the early 2000s, Chechnya, Dagestan, you know, in Georgia as well. So I think that could be an area where we could see something similar happening, right? Some people, and the Chechen battalions are currently fighting in Ukraine, could definitely do something like that within Chechnya. I have no doubt about it. They're probably still waiting for the right moment. But I still don't expect the majority of the Russian people to wake up, you know, in a few weeks and say, oh, let's get Putin out. It's just not going to happen. They've proven themselves to be unwilling to change the course of this war. And so, as much as I applaud what the Russian Free Legion is doing, I think it's great. Unfortunately, it's still not the majority of Russian people that are going to be supporting this. And so we can only expect them to be effective close to the Ukrainian-Russian border, right? Within 10, 20 kilometers, right? Doing a little raid here in Bryansk, in Belgrade, in Rostov, right? They can do this constantly, which is really going to help the Ukrainian forces because it's going to create a lot of instability in Russia. But I'm not expecting it to be spreading like wildfire throughout Russia. That can only happen once there's going to be a major power shift in the government. That means Putin being removed from power and creating a major power vacuum where the Russian people are going to be definitely feeling the chaos ongoing in Russia. But apart from that, that's my expectation, is that it's great that they're doing this, but let's not expect, you know, things to just go completely haywire in Russia in the next few weeks, because I don't think it's going to happen. Anyways, that's it, guys. Let me think what you think about the Zaporizhian counteroffensive, the Ukraine counteroffensive in Zaporizhia, about my comments. And yeah, I can't wait to hear back from you. And please subscribe to my channel if you really enjoy my content. I think now I'm going to be making a lot more videos since the Ukraine counteroffensive has officially started. And I cannot wait to make other videos for you guys. So I'll see you soon and take care of yourselves.